is a Maine native who has worked and lived abroad. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in molecular biology at the University of Maine, he went on to work at the Jackson Laboratory as a research assistant in the field of heart disease. Jarod left Maine to study abroad in Germany, where he first earned a master's in molecular bioengineering and then a PhD in genetics, studying drought resistance in barley. After returning to Maine, Jarod worked for several years at the MDI Biological Laboratory, where he was recently appointed assistant professor studying the biology of aging. The Rollins Laboratory, this is the coolest thing about a scientist, you get to name your lab, I love that, wants to enable people to enjoy longer, healthier lives. A recent revolution in aging research has led to the discovery that the activity of single genes can control the rate at which we age. The Rollins Lab is building on this revolution by studying how life-extending interventions like dietary restriction regulate gene expression to help protect our cells and tissues from declining with age. They use the roundworm C. elegans as a model organism to study human aging, as they share many of the genes as us, and because their short lifespan allows us to rapidly test for interventions that extend longevity. Current work in the Rollins Lab explores how regulation of longevity genes occurs under dietary restriction by investigating how the protein composition of the ribosome determines which mRNAs are selected for translation and which are not. This will so make sense when Jarod's is done. This will be great. And I asked our speakers this year to kind of give me a little fun fact or some type of science inspiration that they may have gotten, because I just thought it was a fun question. So Jarod has admitted that some of his nerdier inspirations have been Isaac Asimov and Star Trek, both original and Next Generation, and I'm totally with you on all of that, so that's pretty great. And we're gonna do, are you good with not having the timer right behind you? You live. Are you guys okay with trusting that Kim can do the timer on her phone until all right. It will be a mystery for everybody how much time Jarod has left.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I want to start off seeing some hands in the audience. Is there anyone here that would like to be immortal? All right, I do see some hands. And well, you're not alone. The quest for immortality by humankind is something that's been going on for hundreds of years. And of course, some of our first attempts were very misguided, right? We were in search for the Philosopher's Stone. It was thought to grant immortality, or the Fountain of Youth, or even the Elixir of Life. But these are essentially misguided. You know, the elixir of life contained things like mercury and sulfur, which were probably in sufficient enough doses to actually be more deleterious than healthy. And actually, the scientific method has only been applied to this pursuit for longevity really only in the last 100 years. And some of the pioneers in this field were like Charlie Brown here, who's a physiologist and neurologist that was actually studying, came up with the idea that, oh, maybe it's a misregulation of our hormones, and this lack of signaling is what's causing us to age. And that actually led to hormone replacement therapy, which is widespread in use in medicine today. And Metchnikoff came up with this idea, well, maybe it's the viruses and the bacteria that inhabit our bodies and release these toxins that kind of accumulate over time, and that's what's actually causing the aging. And in part, he's correct. And this actually led to the idea of probiotics, which you probably hear advertisements for all the time nowadays. And a little closer to my heart, even in the 60s, Clive McKay, who was a nutritionist, actually discovered that rats, that are restricted in the amount of food that they could have. In the absence of malnutrition, just a reduction of the amount of calories, that actually led to this extension of lifespan. And actually, that research and a lot like it inspired the work that I'm doing today. But really, I want to impress upon you all right now, we are actually in the midst of an aging revolution. And this aging revolution started in the model organism I study, C. elegans, that you see here, which is a tiny roundworm that's actually in the soil around us today, even though they're probably a little frozen right now. But what was discovered in this worm is that a deletion of one single gene allowed these worms to actually live longer, up to 40% longer. And that led to the appreciation that actually our genes control the rate at which we age. And that's a very powerful idea because to some extent, we can actually control our genes. But what I want to get to here is that this discovery has led to the appreciation of hundreds of genes that control the rate of aging in tons of different other organisms. And what's important about this discovery is that this simple worm actually contains a lot of the same genes that we do, so that these discoveries have the possibility of being transferred over into human therapies. Now, genes, it's not just, oh, some genes, if you get rid of them, they're pro-longevity. We now appreciate that, okay, some genes, when they're turned up, are better for our health and longevity, and some genes, when they're turned down, are better for our health and longevity. And I want to talk briefly about how genes are actually regulated. They're essentially regulated at two key points. So our genes are encoded in our DNA. But for them to be functional, these genes need to be turned into protein. And that happens in these two steps. One is transcription, where essentially a copy of the DNA is made as RNA. And then that copy is then translated into protein by the ribosome, which you might have heard of. And in the past, the science has essentially focused on changes in transcription as a way to gauge whether a gene is going up or down. However, we now actually have the technology to also look at this other point of regulation, which is translation. And this whole process, just to sound a little scientific, is called the central dogma of molecular biology. And it's as you can imagine, very quite important. And so what my lab is studying is how dietary restriction changes gene expression. Any questions?
Could you explain how dietary restriction changes gene expression?
Well, thank you. Yes, it'd be my pleasure. Well, the heart of the matter is actually what I'm trying to show here is that, yeah, dietary restriction does change things on the transcriptional level, and that's been appreciated for years. But actually, some of the discoveries that we've made is that there's a whole nother level of gene regulation that occurs under dietary restriction, and that's on the level of translation. And if you're thinking about trying to find new targets, new therapeutics to get the benefits of dietary restriction in the absence of the detrimental effects of dietary restriction, like feeling cold or being hungry all the time, loss of libido, having more targets and understanding this process better is going to facilitate that. Another question?
Some years ago I took a river cruise in Chicago and we studied the architecture. It's called the Architectural River Cruise. And basically the bottom line comment from the tour guide was, we have the engineering capability to build a building as, practically as tall as we want to. There are practical limits though, like getting plumbing up that high and things like that. What are the practical limits on longevity for a human being?
Oh, that's a very excellent question. And that's something that some of other research has been focused on, is trying to understand, okay, even if we make an organism, live longer, what aspects of health aren't also extended? And you can imagine that there are some tissues that don't necessarily regenerate, like your bones. Also like ligaments are a little resistant to regeneration. So then knowing that ahead of time is going to be incredibly useful, so we know what are the things actually through bioengineering might we actually be able to replace, and while the rest of your body lives on.
Hello. When temporarily halting the aging process, how do you pinpoint the specific genes within your body out of all the other millions of them?
Well, there is a technology, it's called mRNA sequencing. And essentially what we're able to do is we're take a pool out of all the genes that are being expressed based on the RNA that I was talking about, and we sequence those. And the more sequences we get that align to a specific gene actually corresponds to how much of that gene is present. And then by comparing that between two different conditions, say well-fed versus dietary restriction, we will have an idea, okay, this gene is being upregulated, this gene is being downregulated, and you're able to look at essentially almost all of the genes that are being expressed in a tissue at one point in time. Very powerful technology. It's almost any biologist nowadays is probably using mRNA-seq for something. Next generation sequencing.
Can you explain what dietary restriction is in more detail, please?
Oh yeah, so it comes in many forms. For our worms, they eat bacteria, and we essentially put a nice little lawn of bacteria on a plate for them, and they crawl around on it and eat it. And to restrict them, we actually dilute that bacteria. So as like they're going along and pumping it, they get less food kind of per pump. But there's several different regimens, many of which are even being tested by humans. So there's intermittent fasting, where you might not eat one day, you eat normally for another day, and then the next day you take a break. But essentially, recommend a reduction in calories, not nutrients necessarily, but that calories somewhere around 20-30% of what you normally would to get these effects. And now in humans, we don't know what the effect is on longevity for dietary restriction. Obviously, it takes some time to figure that out, and we need a lot of volunteers, and not a lot of people necessarily want to do that. But there are some very diehard practitioners of dietary restriction. And what we do know is that there, as you might imagine, there are immediate health benefits to that. So the question is, there's little doubt that dietary restriction is good for your health. The real question is it going to extend our longevity? And one of the amazing things about dietary restriction, virtually every single organism it's been tested in, as simple as yeast, as complex as primates, it extends longevity. So it's looking really good that it's going to be a pathway that we can take advantage of for therapies in humans.
I'm going to be asking Jarod at the reception if it's worth it to restrict your diet sometimes. That's just kind of my take on it.